Today's story is so gripping, it reminds us that age never erases danger, set against the brutal beauty of the Wild West. A place of crimson canyons, biting wind, and lonely trails where mercy is rare. Here, destinies cross in moments of violence, and survival favors the prepared. It began with a single stolen object, small in size, but priceless in meaning. And that one choice unleashed consequences far greater than anyone expected. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Under the hard skies of the Old West, a man's honor wasn't something he wore. It was something burned deep into his bones. And there were insults that could only be answered in blood. The desert sun showed no mercy as Rourke Calder knelt in the dust. 4 outlaws closing in on him beneath the towering red spires of Monument Valley. His faded Union blue coat, caked with grit, carried the quiet weight of decades since Appomattox. The youngest of the bunch, barely past boyhood, tore through the old man's saddlebags while the others kept their rifles leveled at the lone rider. They had shadowed him for 2 days, ever since whispers out of Durango claimed a retired Union officer was riding solo with a strong box of gold, his pension scraped together over years of lean army living. Their leader, a scar-faced man known as Wade Blackmore, ripped the leather satchel from Calder's shaking hands. Gold eagles spilled across the red sand, flashing like fallen stars. "Well now, Colonel," Wade sneered, tobacco-stained teeth splitting into a cruel grin. "Looks like the talk was true. That's a fine little retirement you've got there." His hand drifted to the medals pinned over Calder's heart. The Medal of Honor, a Distinguished Service Cross, campaign ribbons stretching from Bull Run to Petersburg. Calder's weathered hand shot up on instinct. "Take the gold," Calder whispered, his voice thin with age but heavy with meaning. "Take every last coin. Just don't touch the medals. They're all I've got left of the men I served with, the brothers who never made it home." Wade's eyes narrowed, sharp and hungry. "Funny thing," Wade said softly. "Why would scraps of tin matter more to you than all this gold, old man?" His filthy fingers closed around the Medal of Honor and tore it free with a harsh rip. In that instant, everything shifted. The change in Rourke Calder's eyes was sudden and chilling. The trembling stopped. His spine straightened despite his 70 years. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold authority of a man who had once led cavalry straight into Confederate gunfire. "I asked you fair," he said evenly. "I even begged. But you couldn't leave it alone, could you?" A flicker of doubt crept into Wade Blackmore's gut, though pride kept it buried. "You threatening me, old-timer? You're on your knees, surrounded by 4 armed men, and you think—" The words died as Calder moved. For someone who had looked moments from breaking, Calder surged upward with shocking speed. His right hand snapped through a practiced motion, drawing a cavalry saber hidden along his left leg beneath the long coat. The blade, kept razor-sharp through the years, caught the sunlight as it cut the air. Wade barely registered the motion before the saber kissed his gun hand, carving a thin red line. His rifle hit the ground as he staggered back, clutching his bleeding wrist and howling curses. The other 3 froze for a heartbeat, their minds struggling to accept what they'd just seen. Calder gave them no mercy in that pause. He pivoted smoothly, the saber humming through a defensive arc drilled into muscle and memory 50 years earlier at West Point. The nearest outlaw, a thick-built brute named Brant Cole, raised his Winchester, but Calder was already inside his reach. The saber's pommel slammed into Brant's temple with a sickening crack, and the man dropped like a felled oak. "That's for touching what wasn't yours," Calder said, his voice cold as iron. The last two outlaws, brothers Silas Dre and Eli Dre, finally found their nerve and brought their guns up. Shots cracked across the desert, echoing off the ancient stone walls, but Calder was no longer where he'd been. He moved like drifting smoke, every step guided by lessons learned in decades of frontier war. He dove behind a clump of sage as bullets ripped through the space his head had occupied. Silas Dre worked his rifle with shaky precision, ejecting shells and reloading on instinct. "He's just one old man," Silas shouted to Eli. "Circle around, pin him down." But Calder had already read their play. As Eli tried to flank him, Calder rolled left, rising into a crouch behind a weathered boulder. His free hand slipped into his coat and came out gripping a Colt Army revolver, the same iron he'd carried at Gettysburg. The Colt spoke once, then again. The first shot chewed dirt at Eli's boots, spraying red sand. The second tore Eli's hat clean away. Both brothers dove for cover, suddenly aware this was no helpless relic. "You boys ever stop to wonder," Calder called out, steady despite the strain, "why a colonel rides alone through country like this?" He didn't wait for an answer. Why a man my age isn't rotting in some Philadelphia boarding house, playing checkers and waiting to die? From behind a rock, Wade Blackmore yelled back, pain and fury tangled in his voice. "You're dead, Calder. There's 4 of us and 1 of you." Calder laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "4 of you? I see 1 bleeding, 1 unconscious, and 2 scared boys who just learned they picked the wrong traveler." He paused, letting the truth settle like dust. "I was leading cavalry raids when your mothers were still in pigtails. I've fought Comanche, Confederates, and men far deadlier than you'll ever be. So here's what happens next." Rourke Calder stepped out from cover with measured calm. The saber rested firm in his right hand, the Colt steady in his left. His faded blue coat flared around him like a torn battle flag as he crossed the open ground. Every sinew in his body hummed with the old, familiar cadence of violence, a lethal rhythm he had prayed he'd never have to dance again. Silas Dre burst up from behind a dead juniper, firing in blind panic. The shots went wide. Fear wrecked his aim. Calder never flinched. He shifted his line, angling so the boulder stayed between him and Eli Dre, while he closed the distance on Silas. "Stand and fight like a man!" Silas screamed, voice cracking as he fumbled to reload. "I am," Calder answered softly, almost with regret. The Colt spoke again. Silas's rifle spun away, the trigger guard blown apart. The young outlaw stared at his burning fingers, stunned. That's when Eli made his move, charging from the flank with a knife, counting on silence to buy him the edge. Calder heard him anyway, a faint scrape of boot leather on stone. Without turning, Calder swept the saber back in a reverse guard. The flat of the blade smashed into Eli's chest, hurling him into the dirt, lungs emptied in a choking gasp. "Stay down, boy," Calder ordered. "You've already been shown more mercy than you earned." He turned back to Silas, who stood pale and frozen, unarmed. "Get your brother. Get Wade Blackmore and the one that's out cold on the horses. Then ride. Ride hard. And don't look back." Silas's eyes flicked to the gold scattered in the dust. Calder's face hardened. "Leave it. Every last piece. Call it the price of breathing past this afternoon." Wade Blackmore, blood soaking through the bandana around his ruined hand, forced himself upright. Rage and humiliation twisted his features. "You think you can just let us walk? You think we won't come back, won't bring 20 men and hunt you down?" Calder leveled the Colt at Wade's chest, his hand steady as cut stone. "You could try, but first you'd have to explain to those 20 men how 4 armed outlaws got whipped by a 70-year-old. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. How you let yourselves get outfought, outmaneuvered, and outshot by a man old enough to be your granddaddy. The truth landed harder than lead. Wade's shoulders sagged as the fight drained out of him. Silas and Eli hauled Brant Cole, still woozy, blood streaking his scalp, up onto a horse. They gathered their weapons in silence, refusing to meet Calder's gaze. "The medals," Calder said quietly. Wade bent down, lifted the Medal of Honor from the sand, and set it carefully on the boulder beside Calder. His hand lingered. Calder caught a flicker in his eyes. Memory, maybe, of a different war. "I had an uncle who fought at Shiloh," Wade said, barely above a whisper. "Union man. Died there. My aunt kept his medals in a tin box on the mantel till the day she passed." Calder nodded once. "Then you should have known better." The four mounted up, ragged, beaten, and diminished. As they rode off, Calder called after them one last time. "If you've got any sense, you'll take this for what it is, a second chance. The West's changing. Men like you and me, we're relics of a bloody age. But you're young enough to choose another road." Wade turned in his saddle, studying the old soldier standing amid gold and dust. "And what makes you so sure we won't circle back and bushwhack you come nightfall?" Calder's smile was thin and grim. "Because you're not stupid. You know I'll be ready. And because somewhere in that black heart of yours, there's still a spark of the boy who honored his uncle's sacrifice. Don't snuff it out." The outlaws vanished into the red rock maze, hoofbeats fading into the vast desert hush. Calder waited a full 10 minutes, senses stretched tight for betrayal. Only then did he lower his weapons. His hands began to shake as the surge ebbed, age and exhaustion claiming their due. He eased down onto the boulder, every one of his 70 years settling into his bones. The saber slipped from his grip and rang against the stone. For a long while, he just sat there, breathing hard, staring at the medals that had sparked the whole deadly reckoning. The Medal of Honor caught the late sun, its blue ribbon still bright despite the years. He'd earned it at Cold Harbor in 1864, leading a desperate charge that saved 2 trapped companies. 40 men had ridden into that hell. 12 had ridden out. "Still causing trouble, aren't you?" he murmured, thumb tracing the worn metal. Faces rose in his mind. Cole Turner, who took a bullet meant for him. Mateo Cruz, who held the line through 3 wounds. Owen Prescott, barely 21, had died in Calder's arms, calling for his mother with his last breath. The gold scattered at his feet meant security, a quiet old age bought and paid for. But the medals meant something no coin ever could. They stood for brotherhood, the bond of men who had stared death in the face together, and for the sacred trust between soldiers. They were the core of who Rourke Calder had been, and who he still was. As the sun slid low and painted the desert in burning orange and violet, Calder gathered the gold with slow, deliberate care. Each coin stood for a month of hard living, salt pork, hardtack, and cold nights. Choosing a warm coat over a hot meal, saving every dollar of a soldier's pension. He had meant to use it to buy a small ranch in Colorado, a quiet place to finish his days in peace. As he counted the coins and slipped them back into the leather pouch, he wondered if peace had ever truly been meant for men like him. The saber slid back into its hidden sheath along his leg. The Colt returned to its shoulder holster beneath the faded blue coat. He pinned each medal back onto his chest, fingers still trembling, aligning them exactly as regulations demanded, though no one remained to inspect him now. Old habits, burned in by military discipline, died hard. His horse, a sturdy roan named Ironhoof, had drifted only a short distance during the fight. Ironhoof had been trained for battle long ago and knew better than to bolt at gunfire. Calder approached him slowly, voice low and steady, the same tone he'd used with cavalry mounts for decades. "Easy, old friend. It's over now." He checked the saddle and bridle, making sure nothing had been cut or loosened, then secured the recovered gold in the saddlebags. Dusk was closing fast, and he needed miles between himself and this place before night fully fell. The Dre brothers and their companions were gone, but the desert held its own threats. Patches of bad ground, rattlesnakes, and the killing cold that swept the high country after sunset. Calder swung into the saddle with a grunt, joints protesting the long day. He rode into the deepening dusk, following a trail that threaded between towering buttes and dry washes. As Ironhoof's hooves settled into a steady rhythm, Calder's thoughts drifted backward through time. He remembered his first posting after West Point, Fort Laramie in 1852. A green lieutenant convinced he knew the world. The Sioux had corrected that notion quickly. Then came the war. 4 years of slaughter that forged him into the man he'd become. After Appomattox, he'd stayed in uniform, unable to imagine life without the Army's rigid order. The frontier wars followed, campaigns against the Cheyenne, the Apache, the Comanche. He'd tried to live by honor, even when orders pressed hard against his conscience. There were moments of shame, choices that still haunted his sleep, times when duty and morality pulled him in opposite directions. Yet through it all, he held fast to his code. Never kill without cause, never harm civilians, never disgrace the uniform. The medals on his chest marked the best of him, the moments when he'd risen above war's darkness with courage and mercy. Night settled fully as he made camp in a sheltered canyon where a spring trickled clear. He built a small fire, more for comfort than heat, and cooked a simple meal of beans and bacon. Above him, the stars emerged, bright and countless in the clean desert sky. Calder leaned against a smooth stone, the Colt close at hand, and thought about the day behind him. In a strange way, the clash with Wade Blackmore's gang had been a gift, a reminder that some fire still burned inside him. Age hadn't stripped him of his skill, but it had warned him. He wasn't young anymore, and luck only stretched so far. The speed and precision that had saved him today dulled a little more with every passing year. His grip wasn't as sure as it once had been. Darkness took longer to clear from his eyes. His knees complained every time he stood. How many more times could experience make up for a body wearing thin? The question lingered as he stared into the shifting flames. He took out the Medal of Honor, lifting it to catch the firelight. The citation that came with it, yellowed, creased from years of folding, rested in his coat pocket. He didn't need to read it. The words were carved into his memory. For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry. The language couldn't touch the truth of that day. The screams of the wounded, the choking smoke, the ground shuddering under artillery, the hot weight of blood soaking through his coat. He'd never felt like a hero. Heroes weren't supposed to be afraid, and he had been terrified. Heroes were meant to be certain, and doubt had gnawed at him even as he led the charge. He'd done only what needed doing, what any officer worth the name would have done to save his men. That others called it heroic had never quite sat right. Still, the medals mattered, not for what the Army claimed they stood for, but for what they meant to him. They were a link to fallen brothers, a reminder of the price paid and of the oath sworn. Dawn found Rourke Calder back in the saddle, riding northwest toward the Colorado line. The fight with the Outlaws had cost him a day, but he could make it up if he pushed. As he climbed higher, the land began to change, the air thinning, the horizon opening ahead. As the trail climbed, the land changed with it. Less red sand, more pine and rock, the air turning cool with the promise of fall. Rourke Calder passed through scattered settlements, dusty clusters of buildings where homesteaders and ranch hands gathered for supplies and news. At one such place, Bitter Creek, he reined in Ironhoof to let the horse rest and to refill his canteen. The general store served as the town's nerve center. A few locals lingered on the porch, their low talk fading as Calder approached. His faded Union blue drew long looks. This was still a divided stretch of country, where old Civil War loyalties hadn't fully loosened their grip. "Help you, stranger?" the storekeeper asked, voice even but guarded. Calder tipped his head politely. "Just need a few things, coffee, bacon, and ammunition if you've got it. 44 caliber. As he paid, he felt eyes drifting to the medals on his chest. At last, an old man by the potbelly stove broke the silence. "You earn those?" he asked, "or buy 'em off some dead officer?" The room went still. Calder turned slowly, meeting the man's hard stare. He could tell at once the man was a veteran. The posture, the scarred hands, the look that didn't flinch. "I earned them," Calder said quietly. "Cold Harbor, Petersburg, the Wilderness, 3rd Cavalry." The old man studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "I was at Petersburg, Confederate side. Lost my brother there." The weight of shared history settled between them. Calder answered softly, "I'm sorry. Too many good men died on both sides." The Confederate veteran rose, joints stiff with age and old wounds, crossed the store and held out his hand. "Name's Amos Reed. I hated every man in blue for 20 years after the war." "That's a heavy thing to carry," Calder said as he shook the man's hand. "And it doesn't serve much purpose now. The war's been over longer than it ever lasted." They talked nearly an hour. Two old soldiers trading memories no one else in the room could fully understand. Gradually, the tension eased, the other customers returning to their business. When Calder finally stepped outside, Amos walked him to Ironhoof. "You headed for Colorado?" Amos asked. Calder nodded. "Got a bit of land waiting near Durango. Feels like time to stop wandering." Amos pulled a worn scrap of paper from his pocket and scribbled an address. "Got a nephew runs a ranch up that way. Good man. Tell him Amos Reed sent you. He'll help you get settled." Calder folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "I appreciate that, Amos. More than you know." As he rode out of Bitter Creek, he reflected on the quiet kindness he hadn't expected. The war had split the nation, set brother against brother, and left scars that would take generations to fade. But it had also taught courage, honor, and brotherhood. Two men who once would have been enemies had found common ground in shared experience and respect. Maybe there was hope for the country yet. The miles slipped by under Ironhoof's steady stride as they climbed higher. 3 days later, Calder crossed into Colorado territory. The air grew thin and sharp, scented with pine and the first hint of winter. The land Amos's nephew had helped him find lay in a sheltered valley, mountains guarding 3 sides and a clear stream cutting through the middle. It wasn't much. A small cabin in need of repair, a barn with part of its roof caved in, fences sagging and broken. But it was his, bought with gold earned through decades of service and saved through years of sacrifice. A place where he could finally lay his burdens down. He spent the following weeks working from dawn to dusk, fixing the cabin and making the place livable. Hands once shaped around a saber learned the weight of a hammer. New calluses formed. His back ached in a different way than it ever had on campaign. Still, there was a deep satisfaction in the labor, a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. At night, worn but content, he slept without dreams of gunfire or blood. Instead, He dreamed of spring gardens, good horses, and a quiet life carved out in the valley. One evening, seated on the repaired porch as the sun sank behind the peaks, Calder finally unpinned the medals from his coat. He'd worn them every day since the war ended. Armor against forgetting, a shield against becoming just another nameless old man. But here, on land that was his, he didn't need them to know who he was. He wrapped the medals in oiled cloth and placed them in a wooden box, setting it on a cabin shelf where he could see it daily without carrying the weight on his chest. Winter came early that year, snow laying a clean white blanket across the valley. Long evenings found Calder by the fire, reading books he'd never had time for in uniform, teaching himself carpentry and animal husbandry by trial and error, building, learning, and slowly settling into the life he'd earned. When the spring thaw finally loosened the ground, Rourke Calder put seed into soil and bought a small herd of cattle. Neighbors, few and scattered in that far-off country, came to know him as a quiet, capable man who kept to himself, yet never turned away when help was needed. He spoke little of his past unless pressed, and even then he kept it brief. Still, word traveled the way it always does in small places. Folks came to understand that the old man in the valley was a war hero, a decorated veteran who had walked away from glory to live plain and honest. Now and then, young men rode up to his cabin, drawn by curiosity or by the hope of hearing from someone who had faced life and death head on. Calder welcomed them inside, poured coffee, and answered straight. "Do you regret it?" one asked. "Leaving the army, coming out here alone?" Calder considered the question, eyes drifting to the mountains he had grown to love. "Regret means I chose wrong," he said at last. "I didn't give anything up. I chose forward. The army was my life for 50 years. It gave me purpose, brotherhood, a place in the world. It also took pieces of me I'll never get back." He gestured toward the valley beyond the window. "This is where I take back what's left." The years rolled on. Calder's hair turned white, his face hardened by sun and wind. His step slowed, his breath grew heavier in the thin air, but his mind stayed sharp. He still rose before dawn to tend stock, still kept the place with a soldier's care. The wooden box holding his medals remained on the shelf, no longer a definition, just a reminder. One summer afternoon, a rider thundered toward the cabin, dust boiling behind the horse. Hearing the approach, Calder stepped onto the porch, hand settling on the colt he still wore out of habit. The rider reined in hard. It was a young man from town. "Mr. Calder, there's been a landslide up at the Morrison Ranch. 3 men trapped, maybe more. We're rounding up anyone who can help dig them out." Calder didn't hesitate. He grabbed his hat and tools. "Give me 2 minutes to saddle up." At the Morrison place, chaos ruled. A section of mountainside had broken loose in a sudden storm, crushing part of the house and burying ranch hands, along with members of the family. Men dug wildly, panic driving them as time ran thin. Calder took it in with the practiced eye of decades in command. "Stop," he ordered, voice cutting through the noise. "You're digging wrong. Look how the slide fell. The main structure would have pushed the debris there." He pointed 20 feet from where they were clawing at rock. The men hesitated, unsure about taking orders from an old rancher. But the certainty in Calder's stance and tone won them over. They shifted their effort. Within minutes, muffled shouts rose from below. Working carefully now, following Calder's directions to avoid another collapse, they cleared timber and stone. One by one, the trapped were pulled free. Bruised, shaken, but alive. Caleb Morrison, the family patriarch, always polite, always distant, gripped Calder's hand, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his face. "You saved them," he said hoarsely. "You saved my whole family. How can I ever repay you?" Calder shook his head. "No repayment needed. We're neighbors. That's enough." Caleb pressed to know more about the man who had read the mountain so well. Over coffee in a borrowed barn while repairs began, Calder shared pieces of his past, the campaigns he'd led, the training in assessing danger, the long years that had taught him where disaster would strike. Word spread quickly after that. People who had seen him as a quiet old veteran began to grasp the depth he carried. They sought his counsel on land disputes, on organizing bucket brigades and volunteer crews. Calder helped where he could, never asking for credit. Still, the past had a way of finding him. One autumn day, a man in a suit rode up to the cabin and introduced himself as Edwin Marsh, a journalist from Denver writing about Civil War veterans. "Colonel Calder," Marsh said, "your record is extraordinary. Why leave the Army? Why hide yourself away out here?" The question struck deeper than Calder expected. "I'm not hiding," he replied firmly. "I'm living. There's a difference. I gave this country 50 years of my life." He met the man's gaze. "I fought in wars that needed fighting, and some that probably didn't. I lost friends, took lives, followed orders that still wake me at night. I earned the right to choose how I spend what time I've got left." Marsh pressed on. "Don't you owe it to the next generation to teach them?" Calder thought for a long moment. Teach them what? That war is glorious? It isn't. That killing gets easy when you believe in a cause? It doesn't. That medals make up for nightmares and guilt? He shook his head. Then his voice softened. "Print this if you want. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what has to be done while you're afraid." "I learned that honor isn't about winning," Rourke Calder said evenly. "It's about how you carry yourself when winning isn't possible. And peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the choice to build instead of destroy." The journalist scribbled fast. "That's profound, Colonel. The country needs voices like yours." Calder shook his head. "The country needs voices calling for understanding and reconciliation, not old soldiers retelling past glories. Print the words if you want. Leave my name out. Let them stand on their own." Edwin Marsh agreed, though Calder suspected the man would try to trace the story back to him anyway. It hardly mattered. The valley was his refuge, and the people there knew him for who he was now, not just who he'd been. As winter edged closer again, Calder felt his body falter in quiet, undeniable ways. His hands trembled more often. His breath shortened. A pain he'd long ignored grew harder to set aside. A visit to the town doctor confirmed what Calder already knew. His heart was wearing out, thinned by decades of strain. "How long?" Calder asked calmly. The doctor hesitated. "Hard to say. Months, maybe years. But you should put your affairs in order." Calder returned to the cabin and spent the next days writing letters. To distant family he'd neglected, to comrades he'd served beside, to the few friends he'd kept over the years. He set his will as best he could, leaving the ranch to the Morrison family, with instructions it be used to help veterans find their footing in civilian life. He took down the wooden box holding his medals and opened it for the first time in years. The decorations shone as brightly as the day they were given, preserved by careful hands. He pinned them to his old blue coat one last time and rode into town. At the general store, he found Noah Pike, who had always treated him with respect. "Noah, I have a favor," Calder said. "When I'm gone, and it won't be long, I want these medals donated to the Territorial Museum in Denver, not for my name, for what they represent. Sacrifice, brotherhood, the cost of freedom." Noah's eyes widened. "Colonel, you can't be thinking—" Calder raised a hand. "I'm an old soldier. I've cheated death plenty. Everyone's luck runs out. Promise me you'll see it done." Noah nodded, voice thick. "I promise." That night, a late storm swept the valley, snow and wind howling around the cabin. Calder sat by the fire with the medals on his chest, thinking of the long road behind him, the frightened boy at West Point, the eager young officer, the hardened veteran, the weary man seeking peace. All of them were him, pieces of a life fully lived. When spring returned, bringing warmth and renewal, Calder, against expectation, was still there to see it. His strength had faded, but his spirit hadn't. Neighbors stopped by more often, claiming fence checks or cattle talk, though their real purpose was to make sure he was managing. Calder accepted the help with grace, knowing that allowing it was its own kind of strength. One morning, as sunrise painted the peaks gold and pink, a lone rider approached. Calder's hand went to his Colt by reflex, then eased when he recognized the tired paint horse. The rider was Wade Blackmore. 5 years had passed since Monument Valley, but Calder knew him at once. Wade dismounted slowly, hands visible and empty. "Colonel Calder," he said, uncertain. "I wasn't sure I'd find you. Took months of asking." Calder studied him. Wade looked changed. Cleaner, less hardened, his eyes carrying something other than the old predator's calculation. "You rode a long way to find the man you tried to rob," Calder said. "Should I be worried?" Wade shook his head quickly. "No, sir. I came to thank you, and to show you something." He reached into his saddlebag and drew out a leather-bound book. "After that day in the desert, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about second chances, about choosing another road." He opened the ledger. "I went straight, used what money I had left, and bought into a freight business in Santa Fe. 4 years now, legitimate work, good name. I married. I have a daughter, May." Warmth stirred in Calder's chest. "That's good to hear, Wade. Truly. But you didn't need to ride all this way just to tell me." Wade looked down, suddenly younger than his years. "I did. Because every time I thought about slipping back, every time the temptation came, I remembered you standing there with that saber. Not because you frightened me, though you did, but because you showed me that honor and strength weren't just words. They were real things, worth fighting for." Rourke Calder invited Wade Blackmore to stay for supper, and they talked deep into the night. Wade spoke of his new life, the hard lessons of honest work, the strain of building something clean from the ground up, and the joy he'd found in being a father. Calder listened, offering a few measured words drawn from long experience, quietly grateful for the change he saw before him. Before Wade left at dawn, Calder did something he had never done before. He took a single campaign ribbon, not the Medal of Honor, not the Distinguished Service Cross, but a simple cavalry ribbon, and pressed it into Wade's hand. "This is for you," Calder said. "Not because you earned it the way I did, but because you fought a different battle. You fought your own worst nature. That kind of courage is rarer than most men ever know." Wade stared at the ribbon, eyes burning. "I can't take this, Colonel. It's yours." Calder closed Wade's fingers around it. "I'm giving it to you so you'll remember that redemption is real, that change is possible. Men can choose to be better than they were. Wear it as a reminder of the road you chose." After Wade rode away, Calder sat on the porch, a deep, steady peace settling over him. The gold he defended in Monument Valley had bought him this ranch, this refuge. But the medals he'd protected had done something far more important. They had turned a lost man toward a better life. That, Calder understood, was the true meaning of the honors he carried. Not glory, not recognition, but the responsibility to stand for something larger than himself. In that moment, every battle, every sacrifice, every painful memory felt worth the cost. The seasons turned again, and Calder's health continued its slow decline. His body finally yielded to 7 decades of hard living. He spent more time by the fire, less in the saddle, but his mind stayed clear. He faced the end with the same calm resolve he'd brought to every trial. When the doctor told him he might have only weeks left, Calder nodded and asked to be left alone. He had preparations to make, not for dying, but for meaning. On a clear autumn morning, aspens blazing gold along the slopes, Rourke Calder dressed in his old Union blue one last time. He pinned each medal to his chest with steady hands, aligning them by regulation, then settled into his chair on the porch. The Colt rested within reach by habit, not fear, as the sun rose over the mountains he loved. The valley lay quiet, pine-scented air carrying the distant lowing of cattle. He thought of the men he'd served beside, the brothers in arms fallen in battles most people had forgotten. He thought of enemies he'd killed, wondering if they'd found peace beyond this life. He thought of the second chances he'd been given and the ones he'd offered others, and he came at last to the truth it had taken him 75 years to learn. A man's worth isn't measured by medals, victories, or wealth, but by the lives he touches and the principles he keeps when compromise would be easier. As the sun climbed, neighbors arrived quietly. Word had spread, as it always does, that this might be Calder's last day. They came not in grief, but in respect. Caleb Morrison and his family, Noah Pike from the general store, Amos Reed's kin, and the young men Calder had counseled over the years, now grown with families of their own. They stood together in silence, honoring a man who had lived with integrity, and helped others do the same. When afternoon waned, Calder felt his strength ebb, but fear never came. He'd met death too often to dread it now. He motioned Caleb Morrison closer. "The medals," Calder whispered. "Make sure they go to the museum. And the letter in my desk, it explains who I was and what they stand for. Make sure people know it's not about praising war. It's about remembering sacrifice." Caleb nodded, tears tracing his weathered face. "I promise, Colonel. We'll tell it right." Calder's eyes returned to the mountains one final time, gratitude filling him for the years of peace they'd given. His hand touched the Medal of Honor, fingers tracing its familiar shape. He thought of the day he earned it, of the men he saved and the ones he lost. And he thought of Wade Blackmore, somewhere in Santa Fe, perhaps looking at that ribbon and remembering that men can change, that honor can be chosen over convenience. That was legacy enough. The sun kissed the peaks, setting the sky ablaze with orange and purple. Rourke Calder drew one last breath and let it go, eyes closing as the light faded. Around him, the gathered neighbors remained still, a quiet circle of respect as the day and a life came gently to its end. Each lost in their own thoughts about the remarkable man who had chosen their valley as his final resting place. In his hand, the Medal of Honor caught the last light of day, shining like a promise kept, a duty fulfilled, a life honestly lived. 6 weeks after Rourke Calder passed, the Territorial Museum in Denver received his medals. They were placed in a position of honor, accompanied by a careful record of his service and the principles that guided his final years. More important still, the exhibit told the story of what those medals meant to him, and how defending them had altered the course of a wayward man's life. Visitors read about the standoff in Monument Valley, about the kind of honor Calder had been willing to die for, and about the redemption that grew from that choice. Wade Blackmore attended the museum's dedication with his wife, Clara, and their daughter, May. Standing before the glass case, May tugged at his sleeve and asked why he was crying. Wade showed her the cavalry ribbon Rourke Calder had given him, now framed and hanging in his office. "Because I knew that man," he said quietly. "And he showed me it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." A curator overheard and asked Wade to tell his story. It was added to the exhibit, a living testament to how one man's unwavering principles could ripple outward, just as Calder had wished. The ranch in the valley became a refuge for veterans struggling to find their way back to civilian life. The Morrison family honored their promise, caring for the land and opening their doors to men in need of healing and purpose beyond war. Over the years, dozens of former soldiers passed through, working the fields, learning new trades, and discovering they could build lives far from the battlefield. Each learned the story of Rourke Calder, of his courage in war and his wisdom in peace. And so, friends, we come to the end of Rourke Calder's journey, from the blood-soaked fields of the Civil War to a quiet Colorado valley, from a young officer chasing glory to an old man who found true peace. His life reminds us that real honor isn't measured by medals or applause. It's measured by the principles we keep when no one is watching, the mercy we show when we hold the power to destroy, and the legacy we leave in the lives we touch. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us. Subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso Legal. Disclaimer: each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.